Cherry County, Nebraska Territory, August 1873. While his neighbors raced to throw up thin-walled frame cabins before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Anderson methodically cut prairie sod into 18-inch blocks, stacking them into walls 3 feet thick. His Irish neighbor Patrick Kelly watched from his half-finished cabin and shouted across the prairie, "Lars, you're building a fort, not a house. That thing'll never dry out." Local carpenter Jim Crawford calculated that Lars could have built 3 frame cabins with the same labor, telling anyone who'd listen, "That Norwegian's got more dirt than sense." They called it Anderson's Earthen Castle. They called him a fool. Standard homestead cabins use 12-inch frame walls filled with prairie hay, completed in 3 weeks for $85 in materials. Lars spent 8 weeks cutting 847 sod blocks, creating walls 36 inches thick at a cost of $23. Then January 1874 arrived. The blizzard that newspapers would call the winter of death hit without warning. Temperatures plummeted to 47 below zero with 60-mile-per-hour winds for 4 straight days. Frame cabins became death traps. Families burned their furniture and floorboards, but couldn't keep interior temperatures above 20 degrees. But that fool's soddy? It held steady at 55 degrees while using half the firewood. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about heat, thermal mass, and survival that every professional builder and experienced homesteader had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The sound of steel cutting through prairie sod carried across the Nebraska flatlands on that sweltering August morning in 1873, a rhythmic scraping that set Lars Anderson apart from every other homesteader in Cherry County, while his neighbors hammered together frame walls as fast as lumber could be hauled from the rail depot. 200 miles east, the stocky Norwegian immigrant worked his homemade soddy plow through the thick buffalo grass, cutting blocks that weighed 50 pounds each and measured exactly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. His movements were deliberate, methodical, shaped by memories of his grandfather's turf houses clinging to the windswept cliffs of Norway's Lofoten Islands, where 2-foot-thick earthen walls had kept fishing families alive through Arctic winters that claimed the unprepared. Patrick Kelly paused in his own cabin construction to watch Lars stack the massive sod blocks like oversized bricks, grass side down, building walls that grew thicker by the hour. The Irishman had arrived in Nebraska Territory 1 year ahead of Lars, long enough to learn the accepted wisdom of Great Plains homesteading, get a roof overhead fast using proven methods, worry about improvements later. His own cabin followed the standard pattern, 12-inch frame walls sheathed in board and batten siding with prairie hay stuffed between the studs for insulation. Quick, economical, adequate for the job at hand. The sight of Lars cutting hundreds of sod blocks when lumber was available struck Kelly as pure stubbornness. "You planning to fort up against the Sioux, Lars?" he called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's enough dirt to build half the county." But Lars continued cutting, his weathered hands steady on the plow handles. He had learned from his father, who had learned from his grandfather, that thin walls made thick graveyards. In the Lofoten Islands, where winter storms drove Arctic air across 1,000 miles of open ocean, survival meant building for the worst conditions, not the average ones. The men who built quick shelters were the men who froze. Now facing the endless grassland of Nebraska Territory, Lars saw the same principle at work. The treeless prairie offered no natural windbreak, no shelter from the continental weather patterns that could drop temperatures 60 degrees in a single day. His neighbors might call it excessive, but Lars knew the difference between shelter and survival. Jim Crawford, the territorial carpenter who had built more than 40 cabins across 3 counties, rode out to inspect Lars's progress in early September. What he found defied every principle of frontier construction he had learned during 5 years of Iowa and Nebraska building. The Norwegian had excavated a foundation 18 inches deep, laid a stone base to prevent moisture wicking, and was now stacking sod blocks in a running bond pattern that created walls 36 inches thick. The interior dimensions measured 16 feet by 20 feet, requiring 847 individual blocks cut from a carefully selected 2-acre plot, where the buffalo grass roots formed the densest mat. Crawford calculated the labor involved and shook his head in professional dismay. "Lars, you could frame 3 cabins with the work you're putting into this dirt pile. What's the point of all that thickness when a standard wall does the job?" The question revealed the fundamental divide between conventional frontier wisdom and traditional building knowledge. Crawford's experience told him that 12-inch walls filled with prairie hay provided adequate insulation for Nebraska conditions. His calculations showed that dimensional lumber, shipped by rail and processed at territorial sawmills, offered predictable performance at known costs. A standard homestead cabin required 3 weeks of construction time and roughly $125 in materials, expensive but manageable for most claiming families. Crawford had built dozens of such structures, and they met territorial requirements for permanent improvement under federal homestead law. From his professional perspective, Lars was solving a problem that had already been solved using methods that required 4 times the labor for marginal improvement. But Lars pressed on, driven by knowledge that transcended local experience. He had spent his youth helping his grandfather select stones for foundation work, learning to read the subtle signs of moisture movement and thermal expansion that determined whether a structure would stand or fail. The old man had taught him that building was not about meeting minimum requirements, but about creating shelter that would protect the next generation. In Norway's coastal climate, where winter temperatures routinely dropped to 40 below zero, and summer storms brought hurricane-force winds, construction methods had evolved over centuries to work with natural materials and environmental forces rather than fighting them. The thick turf walls that seemed excessive to American observers represented accumulated wisdom about thermal mass, moisture control, and structural integrity that had kept families alive for generations. As autumn approached and other homesteaders rushed to complete their cabins before the first hard frost, Lars continued his methodical work. He lime-washed the interior walls using limestone bought from a territorial quarry, creating reflective surfaces that would maximize light and heat distribution throughout the space. He positioned his fireplace in the center of the structure rather than against an exterior wall, following his grandfather's teaching that centralized heat sources worked more efficiently in thick-walled buildings. The total cost of his materials — lime, glass for 2 windows, iron hinges for the door, and stone for the foundation — came to $23, less than 1/5 the cost of a conventional frame cabin. By October, when the first snow dusted the prairie grass, Lars moved into his completed soddy, while 3 neighboring frame cabins remained unfinished due to lumber delivery delays. The thick walls that had drawn months of mockery now seemed merely eccentric as winter approached, and conventional wisdom prepared to prove itself once again. The real test lay ahead, when the Great Plains winter would separate adequate shelter from true protection, and the Norwegians' excessive preparation would face its first judgment against the established methods that had served the territory's growing population of homesteaders. December 1873 arrived with the familiar bite of Great Plains winter, bringing temperatures that dropped to 10 below zero and winds that found every gap in hastily constructed walls. Across Cherry County, homesteaders settled into the rhythm of frontier winter survival, burning precious firewood hauled from distant river breaks at $18 to $27 per cord. In the conventional frame cabins that dotted the prairie landscape, families huddled near cast-iron stoves that consumed 4 to 6 cords of wood through the cold months, creating interior climates that swung wildly from overheated zones within 3 feet of the fire to frozen corners where water buckets developed inch-thick ice by morning. The thin walls filled with prairie hay provided minimal barrier against the relentless cold, and homesteaders learned to sleep in wool coats, banking their fires through the night and rising before dawn to restart the heating cycle that would carry them through another day. Inside Lars Anderson's soddy, a different reality emerged. The massive walls that had drawn months of ridicule now demonstrated their purpose with quiet efficiency. While his neighbors' stoves roared constantly to maintain barely tolerable conditions, Lars found that his centrally positioned fireplace required fuel only in early morning and evening hours. The 3-foot thickness of densely packed sod blocks created a thermal mass system that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, maintaining interior temperatures between 58 and 62 degrees with remarkable consistency. His total wood consumption through December averaged 2.5 cords, nearly half the amount his neighbors burned while achieving superior comfort levels. The physics at work inside the soddy represented principles that frontier builders had never encountered, but that Norwegian coastal construction had refined over centuries. The sod walls functioned as a massive heat storage system, their dense earth composition absorbing thermal energy during periods when the fire burned hotly and releasing that stored warmth gradually as interior temperatures dropped. Unlike frame walls that lost heat rapidly through convection at board joints and thin insulation, the tightly stacked sod blocks created an essentially airtight barrier with thermal properties that buffered interior conditions against exterior temperature swings. The lime-washed interior surfaces reflected heat and light back into the living space, maximizing the efficiency of every piece of burned wood. Patrick Kelly noticed the difference during his first visit in early January, when bitter winds drove snow horizontally across the prairie, and his own cabin required constant stoking to maintain temperatures barely above freezing. Inside the soddy, he found Lars working at his kitchen table in his shirt sleeves, comfortable enough to perform detailed tasks without the heavy wool clothing that Kelly wore even indoors. The contrast struck Kelly as almost supernatural. "How's this dirt house staying so warm, Lars?" he asked, studying the lime-washed walls that seemed to radiate gentle heat. "My place feels like a barn with a fire in it." Lars set down his tools and gestured toward the massive walls that surrounded them. "Stone walls in Norway castles, sod walls on Nebraska plains," he explained in his careful English, drawing on comparisons Kelly could understand. "Same principle. Thick earth holds heat like a storage bank. Your thin walls, they spend heat fast as you make it. These walls, they save heat all day, give it back all night." He led Kelly to an interior wall and pressed his palm against the lime-washed surface. Even 12 hours after the morning fire had died to coals, the sod blocks radiated detectable warmth. The thermal mass effect that Norwegian builders had discovered in Arctic conditions was proving equally valuable on the continental prairie, where extreme temperature swings tested every structure's ability to maintain livable conditions. The growing interest from neighbors created informal opportunities for Lars to explain the traditional knowledge that guided his construction methods. During February visits, when other homesteaders sought brief respite from their constantly cold cabins, he demonstrated how the sod walls worked by comparing interior and exterior temperature differences. While outside air registered 20 below zero, the interior wall surfaces remained at 45 to 50 degrees due to the thermal storage effect. The massive walls created a thermal delay system where heat took 18 to 24 hours to penetrate completely through the 36-inch thickness, meaning interior temperatures lagged behind exterior swings by nearly a full day. When bitter cold snapped across the prairie, the interior walls continued releasing heat stored during previous milder periods. Yet despite mounting evidence of superior performance, many neighbors attributed Lars's success to factors beyond construction methods. Jim Crawford, whose professional reputation rested on conventional frame building techniques, insisted that the soddy's performance resulted from fortunate wind protection or the Norwegians' supposed tolerance for cold conditions. The thick Norwegian blood probably helps him feel comfortable at temperatures that would freeze normal folks, Crawford told other homesteaders, unwilling to acknowledge that his standard methods might be fundamentally inadequate for Great Plains conditions. Besides, one mild winter doesn't prove anything. Wait for a real prairie killer, when temperatures drop to 40 below and stay there. That earthen icebox will turn into a tomb when the real cold hits. The skepticism revealed how deeply conventional wisdom had taken root among territorial settlers who trusted established American frontier methods over foreign building techniques they didn't understand. Crawford's dismissal carried particular weight because of his professional experience and the apparent success of his previous construction projects. Most homesteaders had invested significant resources in frame cabins based on his recommendations, creating psychological resistance to admitting that a different approach might be superior. The social pressure to defend accepted methods intensified as evidence mounted that those methods might be inadequate for the environmental challenges that defined Great Plains survival. As winter deepened and fuel costs mounted, the practical advantages of thermal mass construction became increasingly difficult to ignore. Families burning through expensive firewood supplies at unsustainable rates began asking detailed questions about sod construction techniques, even while publicly maintaining confidence in conventional wisdom. The stage was set for a more severe test that would strip away the comfortable assumptions of normal winter conditions and force a direct confrontation between established frontier methods and traditional building knowledge refined in one of the world's harshest climates. The barometric pressure began dropping on January 12, 1874, bringing the peculiar stillness that experienced plainsmen recognized as the harbinger of catastrophic weather. By evening, temperatures had fallen from a manageable 15 above zero to 5 below, and the western horizon showed the distinctive gray-black wall that signaled an approaching blizzard of unprecedented magnitude. At midnight, the storm struck Cherry County with Arctic fury that would earn it the name the Winter of Death in territorial newspapers. Temperatures plummeted to 47 degrees below zero, while 60-mile-per-hour winds drove snow horizontally across the prairie, creating drifts that buried cabin roofs and transformed the landscape into an unrecognizable wasteland of white death. Inside Patrick Kelly's frame cabin, the battle for survival began within the first hour of the storm's arrival. The 12-inch walls that had seemed adequate during normal winter conditions proved helpless against the sustained assault of Arctic air driven by hurricane-force winds. Despite burning furniture, floorboards, and every scrap of combustible material in desperate succession, Kelly could not maintain interior temperatures above 20 degrees. Ice formed on the interior walls 3 feet from the stove, and his children's breath created frost clouds that settled on their blankets. By the second day, with their fuel supplies exhausted and frostbite threatening the family's extremities, Kelly faced the reality that his conventional frontier shelter had become a death trap that offered little protection from conditions his Irish experience had never prepared him to face. Jim Crawford's situation deteriorated even more rapidly in his professionally built cabin, where standard construction techniques failed catastrophically under the extreme conditions. His family crowded into the kitchen area, burning barn lumber torn from their livestock shelter in a futile attempt to create a warm zone large enough to sustain life. The thin walls transmitted cold so efficiently that interior temperatures followed exterior readings with deadly precision, dropping to levels that made survival impossible despite continuous burning of every available fuel source. Crawford's years of frontier building experience proved worthless against weather conditions that exceeded the design parameters of conventional Great Plains construction, exposing the fatal limitations of methods that worked adequately under normal circumstances but failed when tested by the environmental extremes that defined continental climate survival. 3 miles away, inside the soddy that neighbors had mocked as excessive, Lars Anderson experienced the blizzard as a manageable inconvenience rather than a life-threatening crisis. The massive sod walls that had absorbed heat during December's milder weather now released that stored thermal energy with devastating effectiveness against the Arctic assault. Interior temperatures held steady at 55 degrees without requiring extreme fuel consumption, demonstrating the thermal mass principles that Norwegian builders had developed to survive coastal Arctic conditions. The 36 inches of densely packed earth created an insulating barrier so effective that the interior wall surfaces remained at 45 degrees even when exterior air reached its 47 below minimum, proving that proper thermal mass construction could defeat environmental conditions that rendered conventional methods useless. The physics of thermal mass storage reached full demonstration during the 4-day duration of the killing storm. Heat that had penetrated the sod walls during previous weeks continued working its way through the dense earth blocks, creating a thermal reservoir that sustained comfortable interior conditions without the desperate fuel consumption that was killing families in frame cabins across the county. Lars burned less than half a cord of wood during the entire crisis, maintaining not just survival conditions but actual comfort levels that allowed normal daily activities to continue. The lime-washed walls continued reflecting available light and heat throughout the space, while the centrally positioned fireplace distributed warmth efficiently through the thermal mass system that his grandfather's Arctic experience had taught him to create. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, Patrick Kelly made the decision that saved his family's life. With interior temperatures in his frame, cabin approaching lethal levels, and his fuel supplies completely exhausted, he bundled his wife and 3 children in every available blanket and fought through waist-deep snowdrifts to reach Lars's soddy. The Norwegian opened his door to find the Kelly family on the verge of hypothermia, their faces blue with cold and their movements sluggish with the early stages of freezing. Without hesitation, Lars welcomed them into his 16 by 20-foot space that now housed 9 people in conditions of warmth and safety that Kelly's larger and more expensive frame cabin could not provide even for his own family. The contrast between the two structures during the remaining days of the storm provided dramatic proof of the superiority of thermal mass construction over conventional frontier methods. While Kelly's abandoned cabin became an ice-filled shell, where temperatures matched the exterior readings, the soddy maintained its steady 55-degree interior climate with remarkable consistency. The children, who had been approaching hypothermia in their own home, recovered quickly in the stable warmth that the sod walls provided. Kelly later wrote in his journal that the experience transformed his understanding of frontier survival. "The Norwegian's dirt castle saved our lives. I called him a fool, and he treated me like family. Now I know which one of us was the fool." The thermal performance that sustained 9 people through conditions that killed families in conventional shelters demonstrated principles that American frontier builders had never encountered. The sod walls created a thermal buffer system that absorbed exterior temperature changes so slowly that interior conditions remained stable, despite weather fluctuations that rendered frame construction uninhabitable. As the blizzard finally exhausted itself after 4 days of Arctic fury, the difference between adequate shelter and superior protection had been measured not in degrees of comfort, but in the margin between life and death that separated traditional building knowledge from conventional frontier wisdom. The scorching heat that descended on Nebraska territory in July 1874 tested frontier construction methods with the same merciless intensity that winter's Arctic blast had brought 6 months earlier. For 12 consecutive days, temperatures climbed to 118 degrees, while hot prairie winds transformed the grassland into a furnace that made normal daily activities impossible. The same frame cabins that had failed catastrophically during the winter of death now became uninhabitable ovens where families could not sleep, work, or find relief from the relentless heat that penetrated thin walls with devastating efficiency. Homesteaders who had survived the killing cold by burning every combustible material in their cabins now faced the opposite extreme, where no amount of ventilation or shade could make their frame structures tolerable for human habitation. Jim Crawford's professionally built cabin registered interior temperatures of 95 degrees by noon and climbed steadily to 103 degrees during mid-afternoon hours when the sun struck the western walls with full intensity. The board and batten siding that had provided minimal insulation against winter cold now conducted exterior heat directly into the living space, creating conditions that threatened heat exhaustion for anyone who remained indoors longer than necessary. Crawford's family joined neighbors in sleeping outdoors under makeshift lean-tos, abandoning their expensive frame shelter during the hours when interior conditions became life-threatening. Even livestock sought cooler temperatures in the crawl spaces beneath cabins, finding marginally better conditions in the shaded areas that remained several degrees cooler than the interior spaces above. Patrick Kelly, Rebuilding his cabin with improved construction methods learned from his winter ordeal, discovered that frame construction principles failed equally catastrophically in both seasonal extremes. His new structure, built with thicker walls and better insulation based on hard-won experience with Nebraska's continental climate, still reached interior temperatures that made occupation impossible during the peak heat hours. The Kelly children developed symptoms of heat exhaustion despite every ventilation method their father could devise, forcing the family to seek shelter in a hastily dug root cellar that provided the only relief available within the limitations of conventional frontier construction. The same building methods that had nearly killed them in winter now threatened their health in summer, proving that conventional frontier wisdom was fundamentally inadequate for the environmental extremes that defined Great Plains survival. Inside Lars Anderson's soddy, the thermal mass principles that had provided winter heating now demonstrated their cooling potential with equal effectiveness. The massive sod walls that had stored and released heat during Arctic conditions now worked in reverse, absorbing exterior heat so slowly that interior temperatures peaked at 72 degrees during the hottest afternoons. The same thermal delay system that had protected the family from 47 below cold now buffered them against 118-degree heat, creating interior conditions that remained comfortable throughout the most extreme weather the territory had experienced. The lime-washed walls that had reflected precious heat during winter now reflected unwanted heat back toward the exterior, while the Earth's natural cooling effect maintained stable temperatures that made normal daily activities possible even during the peak of the heat wave. The scientific principles governing the Saudis' superior performance operated through the same thermal mass storage system that had proven so effective during winter conditions. Earth's low thermal conductivity meant that heat penetrated the 36-inch sod walls very slowly in both directions, requiring hours for exterior temperature changes to work their way through the dense blocks toward interior surfaces. During the most extreme summer heat, much of the thermal energy dissipated before reaching the interior walls, creating a natural air conditioning effect that no frame construction could duplicate. The soil temperature at 3-foot depth remained constant around 55 degrees year-round, providing a thermal sink that moderated interior conditions regardless of surface weather extremes that challenged human survival. Dr. William Foster, the traveling physician who served 3 Nebraska counties, visited the Anderson Soddy during the height of the heat wave and documented conditions that contradicted everything territorial settlers believed about Earth construction. His thermometer readings showed interior temperatures 46 degrees cooler than exterior conditions at the same time of day, achieved entirely through passive thermal regulation without any mechanical cooling methods. Foster's medical training provided him with analytical tools to evaluate the health implications of different construction approaches, and his observations revealed that families living in sod structures showed significantly lower rates of heat-related illness during extreme temperature events. His written account in the territorial newspaper provided the first scientific documentation of thermal mass construction principles. Mr. Anderson's earth construction demonstrates superior climate control through natural thermal regulation. What frontier settlers dismissed as primitive building methods proved scientifically sound when subjected to measurement and analysis. The dramatic performance difference between frame cabins and sod construction during the summer crisis began breaking down the social resistance that had protected conventional building wisdom from serious challenge. Neighbors who had attributed Lars's winter success to favorable wind conditions or Norwegian cold tolerance could not explain away the objective comfort of his soddy during heat that made their own homes uninhabitable. Children who had nearly frozen in frame cabins 6 months earlier now played comfortably inside the soddy while their families sought relief in whatever shade they could find outside their overheated conventional shelters. The evidence was becoming too compelling for even the most committed defenders of established frontier methods to dismiss with explanations about lucky circumstances or unusual personal characteristics. Crawford himself, whose professional reputation depended on maintaining confidence in standard construction techniques, found his certainty eroding as he observed the consistent superior performance of thermal mass construction through both seasonal extremes. The The same excessive preparation that he had calculated as wasteful during Lars's initial construction phase now appeared as sophisticated engineering that addressed environmental challenges his conventional methods could not handle. The stage was set for a fundamental reassessment of frontier building wisdom as the accumulated evidence of two seasonal crises forced homesteaders to confront the possibility that their accepted methods were inadequate for the continental climate that defined Great Plains survival. By spring 1875, the conversion had begun in earnest across Cherry County, as 7 neighboring homesteads commenced sod construction projects that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier when Lars Anderson first cut his prairie blocks to community mockery. Patrick Kelly led the transformation, designing a hybrid structure that combined sod walls with frame interior finishing, applying lessons learned during his family's near-death experience in conventional shelter. His new construction followed Lars's basic principles, while adapting them to Irish building preferences, creating 30-inch sod walls with wooden interior framing that provided familiar finishing surfaces while maintaining the thermal mass benefits that had saved his family's lives. The project required 4 months of methodical work, cutting and stacking over 600 sod blocks in patterns that Kelly had studied during his grateful residence in the Norwegian Soddy during the Winter of Death. Jim Crawford's capitulation represented the most dramatic shift in territorial building philosophy, as the professional carpenter who had dismissed sod construction as primitive wastage now undertook his own 20 by 24-foot soddy for his expanding family. Crawford's professional pride initially resisted acknowledging that his conventional methods were fundamentally inadequate for Great Plains conditions, but the accumulated evidence of 2 seasonal crises had destroyed his confidence in frame construction techniques that consistently failed when tested by environmental extremes. His new design incorporated technical improvements learned through careful observation of thermal mass principles, including proper drainage systems, foundation moisture barriers, and lime washing techniques that maximize the efficiency of earth construction. The transformation from skeptic to student represented more than personal conversion. It signaled the collapse of professional resistance to traditional building knowledge that had proven superior to established American frontier methods. The measured results documented by territorial land office records revealed the statistical superiority of sod construction with compelling precision. Homesteads utilizing earth construction methods showed 90% lower abandonment rates during extreme weather seasons compared to frame cabins, demonstrating that thermal mass building techniques provided survival advantages that translated directly into settlement success. Fuel consumption data collected from supply merchants showed that sod structures averaged 65% less firewood usage than conventional frame construction, creating economic benefits that accumulated significantly over multiple heating seasons. Medical records maintained by Dr. Foster documented fewer respiratory ailments, heat exhaustion cases, and cold-related injuries in families occupying sod structures, attributed to the stable interior temperatures and humidity levels that thermal mass construction maintained regardless of exterior weather extremes. The spread of technical knowledge accelerated as Lars began teaching proper sod construction methods to neighbors who had once ridiculed his building approach. His instruction covered the complete process from site selection through finishing techniques, emphasizing principles that Norwegian builders had developed through generations of Arctic construction experience. Students learned to cut blocks at optimal moisture content when prairie grass roots provided maximum binding strength, to stagger joints in masonry patterns that distributed structural loads evenly, and to install proper drainage systems that prevented foundation moisture problems. The lime washing techniques that created reflective interior surfaces required specific mixing ratios and application methods that maximized light distribution and thermal efficiency. Quilt-based draft control systems provided effective window and door sealing using materials available to frontier families, completing the thermal envelope that made earth construction so effective for continental climate survival. By 1880, territorial surveys documented an estimated 60,000 sod structures across the Great Plains, representing the rapid adoption of building methods that homesteaders had initially dismissed as foreign eccentricity. The Nebraska soddy had become recognized architecture that German, Swedish, and Czech immigrants adapted to their own cultural preferences while maintaining the fundamental thermal mass principles that provided superior environmental performance. Homestead National Historical Park preservation efforts later documented that families in sod houses survived weather conditions that killed neighbors in conventional frame structures, creating historical records that confirmed the life and death importance of proper construction methods for continental climate settlement. Modern thermal analysis conducted by engineering researchers validated the effectiveness of 3-foot sod walls, measuring R30 insulation equivalent that matched contemporary energy-efficient construction standards, achieved entirely through traditional materials and building techniques. Lars Anderson's quiet vindication came not through boasting about his foresight, but through the practical results that spoke more convincingly than any argument could have managed. When neighbors praised his wisdom in choosing earth construction over conventional frame methods, the Norwegian would respond simply, "My grandfather knew cold. I just listened." By 1878, successful enough to afford dimensional lumber for any construction project he might choose, Lars deliberately expanded his original soddy rather than building frame additions, demonstrating continued confidence in the thermal mass principles that had proven superior to imported building methods. His decision reflected deep understanding that the best technology was not necessarily the newest or most expensive, but rather the approach that worked most effectively with local materials and environmental conditions that defined Great Plains survival. The lasting legacy of the Nebraska sod construction movement extended far beyond the immediate practical benefits that enabled homestead families to survive continental climate extremes. Museums across Nebraska Territory preserved sod construction artifacts and documentation that illustrated how traditional European building knowledge had adapted successfully to American frontier conditions when conventional methods failed. Modern earthship builders studied historical soddy techniques for insights into passive thermal regulation and natural building materials, discovering that 19th century homesteaders had developed sustainable construction methods that contemporary green building movements were rediscovering through scientific research. The fundamental lesson endured through changing architectural fashions and technological innovations. Working with local resources and natural thermal principles often produced superior results compared to expensive solutions that fought environmental conditions rather than partnering with them. The transformation of Cherry County's building practices from conventional frame construction to widespread sod adoption demonstrated that practical results could overcome even the strongest social resistance to unfamiliar methods, but only when environmental conditions tested those methods beyond their design limits and exposed their fundamental inadequacy for the survival challenges that defined frontier life on the American Great Plains.